everyone, and welcome to our Coastal Resilience and Sustainability Initiative series of events for the fall semester. I'm really excited today to welcome you all to our panel discussion, and in just a minute I will introduce you to our distinguished panel that we have here today. I'm Mary Watson. If you don't know me, if you're new to joining us, Director of the initiative. And let me just take half a second, well, actually half a minute or so, to set the stage just a little bit. From the very beginning of our initiative, we've really emphasized the importance of engagement. If you pull up our white paper, which our leadership group pulled together almost a year ago now, we identified community engagement as a really important priority, talked about the importance of developing an engaged research portfolio, and in your survey responses, those of you who are attending who have filled out the survey to be part of this initiative, you all talked about engagement as being really important, and so important that we identified engagement as one of our priority themes. I'm just going to read you briefly what we wrote, just to remind you that we seek a mutually beneficial engagement that emphasizes social equity. We want holistic approaches that respect communities, consider cultures, the roots of poverty, and intersectional environmental science and justice offer the surest path to sustainable development and long-term resilience. Co-production of future research agendas with our partners is a pervasive goal across most of the undertakings of this initiative. So I want you to sort of keep that in mind today as we share perspectives on what that really means and why it's so important. So let me now turn to the distinguished panel who I'm so excited to have here with us, and I'm going to ask each of you first to introduce yourselves, just to tell our audience just a little bit about who you are and what you do, and maybe just a hair about your connection to this really important topic. And we can just go down the line and start alphabetically with Leslie Boney.
All right. Thank you, Mary, and thanks for all the work you're doing on this initiative. It's really hard to start something out of the air, and I think as you've been looking around, you've discovered that there is more than air going on here, but still to organize and put some bounds around a complicated set of topics, I think is really hard. So very impressed with the work y'all have been doing on this. My name's Leslie Boney, and I'm have two jobs at NC State. First, I'm Vice Provost for Outreach and Engagement, and second, I am the Director of the Institute for Emerging Issues. In that job, I sort of report to myself. In the other job, I report to the Provost.
Oh, that's it. Okay. Hi, I'm Casey Busch, and I am an assistant professor in the College of Education. I'm also on the Coastal Resilience Leadership Group and have been involved with Mary's leadership on that for about a year now. And so my research has been about climate change education with youth. That's the past, and in the future I have a project looking at how people come to understand climate change in coastal communities through kind of their social networks and how they learn from one another. My involvement with engagement has been through all areas of my scholarship, and so I speak to, I think, engagement in research, engagement in teaching, and engagement in service. So I'm happy to be here to talk about those things.
So I'm Jean Goodwin. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication and also a member of the Leadership in Public Science cluster. My research is in science communication, and so I'm very interested in studying best practices for public engagement and also building an infrastructure here on campus to help STEM folks from graduate students all the way up to full professors expand their capacity to do this important work.
Hi, I'm Susan White. I'm the director of North Carolina Sea Grant, the North Carolina Water Resources Research Institute, and North Carolina Space Grant, all of which are housed in the Office of Research and Innovation. We are excited to be here A lot of our programs, our Sea Grant and our Water Institute, have a lot of extension and engagement in our communities to address and engage with them to address their needs. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think we can learn a lot from each other and think about how we look forward to what NC State can bring across our state in co-production and extension engagement. So thank you for having us.
Thank you for being here. I just want to mention to our audience that you are a part of this dialogue today. So I'm going to start us off with some questions for our panel, but be scratching your heads and thinking, and I know you all will have questions and comments, and we will call upon you to engage after we get rolling here. So just know that we have a few folks in the room, but most of you are online. So if you're online, you can ask questions when we get there in two ways, either by putting your question in the chat, and Amanda Mueller will read those questions to our panel to answer, or share those comments with the panel for their reaction. Or if you are so bold as to want to speak, I think we can capture that, and we'll ask you to put your hands up. Is that correct, team? We cannot. Okay. So that means you will have to type. So please do type your questions into the chat box, and we will relay those to our team. So let me start by maybe breaking our group into twos. We're bookended on both sides by folks who really think a lot about how to engage with communities and who engage with communities all the time. And I'm wondering if Leslie and then Susan, if you could each tell us about your roles engaging with communities, how you reach out and engage with communities, some of the maybe essential elements of community engagement, and maybe talk a little bit about how and why community members want to engage with NC State. What brings them to us? Why are they interested in partnering with us? Maybe we'll reverse the order and start with Susan on that?
Sure. A lot of questions in there.
There are, so take your time and pick the ones you really want to talk about.
No, that's great. So for Sea Grant and the Water Institute specifically, we have extension specialists as part of our program. And these are coordinated and collaborating with cooperative extension, but we're not part of cooperative extension, which of course is a huge draw for NC State as a land-grant institute. From our extension perspective, we are embedded in our communities. So we have team members in Wilmington, we have team members in Moorhead, and we have team members out in Manteo, in addition to here in Raleigh. And that longevity of our team members in those communities and within their networks of those communities really makes a difference as to how we engage in communities. Those extension specialists all have different expertise, from fisheries to watershed planning to economics and education. And so we lean on those specialists to hear and listen, which is a key piece to community engagement, listen to the needs of our community. The design of extension really is to bring the needs of a community as voiced by that community to our academic excellence across NC State and across the UNC system broadly, and our private institutions and community colleges where the expertise lies, as you all will hear today. And so I think when we think about why communities think about NC State for extension, it is often through those trusted relationships that allow those honest conversations to happen. And the listening aspects are a key piece and a skill that I would argue we need to be trained in, to hear, not just to project what our needs are and what we think is important, but to actually listen and hear. So I'll leave it at that for question number 2, if that one maybe.
All right.
So a little more background on me. I have been for the past 30 years working with communities across the state on 4 different statewide projects with a number of partner communities ranging from 13 to 76. And immediately prior to coming to NC State, I worked for 10 years in the system office, working with the 16 and a half campuses of the UNC system on things related to community and economic engagement. Here, with the Institute for Emerging Issues, our time spent working on every emerging issue is rounding up the usual suspects around the state and trying to find the unusual suspects around the state who care about an issue, and then really trying to lift up their work in a meaningful way. So the function of the Office of Outreach and Engagement has a three-part mission that is captured in what's called the University Civic Action Plan that the Chancellor signed off on earlier this year. And that involves creating taking steps to try to create a more abiding and deep and vibrant culture of engagement on the campus, forming new partnerships across the campus, and building our capacity to do more. So there are a number of initiatives attached to each of those, but that's kind of landscape of how I care. The why I care is that I honestly believe that our state is at a point where we've got really hard things to figure out, and it's not going to be ideas that are created exclusively in a laboratory or in a professor's office, that it has to be iterative. And there are people across the state that are doing remarkable things that we don't know about. And there are people at NC State that are doing remarkable things that the rest of the state doesn't know about. And we've got to find a way to bring those two strands of remarkability together in some kind of way that is meaningful and useful to the state.
That's terrific. And I think there is an incredible amount of creativity and thoughtfulness and perspective on those wicked problems, as we sometimes call them, in the community. So figuring out how to harvest that is such an important part of addressing those challenges. So Susan and Leslie engage with communities and help bring them to NC State. Jean and Casey are researchers who have research agendas of their own and want to work with community partners as part of that. So can you talk a little bit about your research and why it's important for you to co-produce your research questions? Maybe talk a little bit about if you want to work in a community with community partners in this way, how do you approach that? Maybe give an example of that from your own work.
Okay, I'll go first. I should also say that I neglected to mention another affiliation of mine. I'm also in the Leadership in Public Science cluster, right? There's so many, titles that we have.
Have multiple identities, yes.
So anyway, I'm a newer researcher, right? I have the gray hair, but I came to this late. And so I think when we consider public engagement, I'm on the newer end of figuring out how to do this. But I think that, what Leslie said is that it really does kind of reside at the heart of how I want to continue to conduct my research. And I think it's something that will grow over time, which I think is an important consideration in anyone who has not attempted public engagement within their research or their teaching or their service, that we can learn to do it better and over time. So I tend to think of public engagement as a gradient, and I heard also Leslie using the phrase, right, like engagement with, right? So you can do, research on a community, research with a community, or research for a community. And I think there's even shades of gray in between those. I think where I'm at now
There's
is
also
maybe
research to a community.
Yeah, right. So so I think where I am now on that continuum is research with communities. It is, and even within that, like I said, I think there's a continuum of involvement. So I'm just thinking this as a trajectory of growth over time, and also as a function of where I am in the tenure track, right? I think that the research that I'm doing the publications that I'm producing, that's at the forefront also of how I continue to work in this job. So it's a balancing act is what I'm saying at this point. So an example of research that I have conducted with communities, it's not related to coastal resilience, but I've engaged with science centers across the state, and we're working with about 36 science centers to move towards collective impact, and working with kind of a community partner, and then all of these participants. So I had an idea of what research that I was interested in, which is how individuals in a community of practice learn from one another, and then how they improve their practice over time as a function of working with one another. So my research with communities, I kind of picture it as two columns in my head, right? So I have my research interests that are pretty academic and sterile, and then we have the community partners that, right, this is real work that we can do with the community to meet their needs. And so where can I find a place to make those kind of two columns touch and overlap? And that takes some massaging. So finding the community partners. This was actually, the community partner came to me and said, we want to improve evaluation across the state. Can you help me? And I said, as a matter of fact, I can. And then also I have this research agenda that I'm kind of layering over the top. So I think there's a constant overlap and a constant tension and a constant negotiation when you approach research in this way. And that project is in its third year. And I, to your point about trust, right? Trust has built up over time with those community partners. And I see this type of research then continuing on and developing also over time. And we're going to be able to work together on deeper issues that they have. And I'll be able to continue answering the research questions that I have. So I see it as a give and take. It's an attention and an overlap, and it's constant.
So I want to step back and just talk about the keyword of co-production for a minute, because that is a very abstract idea. But in fact, I think the necessity of co-production is kind of obvious if we think of ourselves as ordinary people and not just as scholars, researchers, or scientists. In our ordinary lives, when we're thinking about what to do, the scientific research is not our first choice of source. If I'm thinking about a new exercise program, like it's New Year is coming up, I'm going to make some resolutions about how to eat, and what kind of, should I start lifting weights or something? What am I going to do? I'm going to think about how I feel, how my history of trying different things. I'm going to talk to my friends. If I go online, it's probably to look for a scientific article that agrees with what I think anyhow, just to reinforce my sense that I'm doing the right thing. But despite the fact that exercise science and nutrition science are producing very large results, and as a society, we're investing a lot of money in it, that's no human being's first turn is towards the scientific literature. What co-production means is that the scientists and communities partner from the beginning so that the voice of science becomes one of the many voices involved actually in the conversation. So it's not an outsider voice that helicopters in and drops some academic articles and then leaves, but it's a legitimate, well-trusted, as Susan pointed out, well-trusted voice that's already involved in the conversation. And that can have really great impacts on both communities and scientists. I think the community impacts, I think as researchers, we're all very aware of the community impacts. Like I do think that we all want to make a difference in the world with our work. And we all believe that even if it's small, that we have something to contribute to these conversations. But so I think that we already believe that we can help communities. What we may not think clearly enough is about how communities can help us. And I do think the most exciting, you don't have to compromise your research program. You can find exciting questions, maybe even more exciting questions, if maybe you're not orienting quite as much to the supposed cutting edge of the field where you make some little incremental step forward, but maybe to the real big problems. And so it can be transformative to your research agenda in the long term, because as Casey stressed, it is very much developmental. It takes years to become a trusted voice. It takes years to understand the community and start seeing how you might fit in. That's why it's necessary to begin that work right now. Now, in fact, here at NC State, I don't do that much outreach to the general community. I call what I do, my work is in-reach. So the community that I try to bring my scholarship to and try to find opportunities for co-production is scientists, because they're doing this practical task of science communication. I'm very interested in how that works, and it is a lot more fun to collaborate with scientists. I can write a lot of articles, and no scientist is ever going to read them, even though I'm convinced that they'll solve all the world's problems. But if I work with people and I collaborate with them on their communication projects, on outreach in their research, on various kinds of teaching projects, we'll slowly begin to understand each other better. And then it gives me an opportunity to share my communication research, and it really has brought up large numbers of live research questions that I would never have encountered otherwise. So co-production, ideally, it takes a big investment, but it ideally has these deep benefits for both sides. Everyone ends up happy.
Mary, can I just pick up on a theme that I think I've
Absolutely.
heard from everybody? And in the civic action plan I was talking about earlier, we iterate 8 principles of community engagement, but I really think it almost comes down to one. I was going to say, talk about the 3 R's, which is another thing I sometimes do, but I really think it comes down to one of the R's. And what I've heard from everybody is this notion of reciprocity. So not doing research to somebody, but with somebody and giving them knowledge that they can use, they can do something with. So the do part of the think and do paradigm, I think, is really important. And I think everybody on some level has highlighted that. And I think the reciprocity, what that does, as Jean was just saying, is it informs the research. So, classically, cooperative extension service could develop a seed that they thought would grow, but until they actually test it out in the community and realize what real growers do, then it only works in the greenhouse. And I think, we have examples from all over the university of research that's gotten better because of its application. I'm thinking with regard to coastal resilience, the work that College of Design has done in Princeville, rebuilding the community. They could have, dumped a plan on Princeville and said, here's how you rebuild, but instead they actually did the hard work of being in conversation with community and realizing that the theory wasn't going to work with the exact lived reality of the people there. And so the rebuilding process was much more complicated, but it was also much more successful because of that appreciation of reciprocity. And I really think as we try to imagine what this Coastal Resilience Initiative is going to work with, building that in from the beginning, I think is really important.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of thinking about reciprocity, and if I can just share a brief story from a long time ago and far, far away, when most of you know me as Dean of the College of Natural Resources and now in this role, but I used to do engaged research, and I got into it through a strange vehicle called Technical Assistance Grant. Now, the very title suggests one way. So those were grants that EPA would give to technical people like myself to help interpret research results for the community. And in this case, it was associated with a Superfund site near my former university. And so I was translating the information about what the scientists were finding on the site and changing the language so the community could engage with that. But the EPA, and not to throw darts at anyone, because EPA is in many ways a leader now in two-way engagement, but back in those days, their thought was I would come in and pontificate about, the pollutants and pontificate about what their proposed solution would be. And as that was happening, I got increasingly uncomfortable because the community didn't want the solution that EPA was proposing, which was to build a football field size containment on the shores of Lake Champlain that would have been 2 stories high. You know, what a blight on the waterfront. So I switched my technical assistance in trying to impress upon EPA why the hell that wasn't going to work, you know? And what maybe they could frame it, listen to what the community wanted around that site. And that went from there. Now that's a very simple, and it's not really research, but you know, there is the two-way street. I went from there to working on another hairy problem, which is still out there, toxic cyanobacteria blooms. And people's dog, we had those blooms. I wanted to understand them. So step 1 was a citizen sampling effort. So I could sample 15 sites with my graduate students. If I engaged the public to gather data for me as well, and for them, I eventually grew that network to 45 sites and posted on a weekly basis what I found, so the community members who gathered that data could see it in real time. And it went from there to generating just very different ways of thinking about the problem of non-point source pollution and learning from the knowledge of the old-timers who had lived there forever and saw what was happening on the waterfront. It actually made me a better grant writer and brought more money in by learning from the community. And that relationship went on for 12 years. It was one of the best ones of my entire life. Could you share any examples that come to mind for you about that reciprocity, as Leslie called it, and how it might be benefiting you, or stories you know of how it's benefited others? Susan, you interact with so very many researchers now.
I think there's 2 sides, if I may. One is our own team is experts in their space as well. And so when one of our more current examples is with the city of New Bern post-hurricane and flooding impacts, and how thinking about who the leaders are in that community and the community of practice that needs to be developed around a place. That the role of connecting and coordinating is often one of those engagement responsibilities. And so in New Bern, with the Boys and Girls Club, with Habitat for Humanity, the trusted leaders in those spaces that were dealing with that emergency, which was long-standing before and after the hurricane impacts, those relationships have now, over the years, evolved into this two-way exchange of understanding not only design implications for rebuilding in floodplains or floodplain retreat, or how we look at a community and their culture in that community to retain aspects that the community desire, but also our advisory board for our Sea Grant program now has a representative from the Boys and Girls Club in that area, because that's a valued relationship. And we want to make sure that we hear from those leaders in the communities. Often they're church leaders in other communities. How we engage them, I would say sort of in a cold way, corporately, so that they can understand the culture from which we're operating is a big piece too. And that two-way benefit, I think, is good. So I'll leave it at that. There are other examples I'm sure you all have.
I can speak to a potential project. It's not one that's been enacted, right? So I've just recently received funding for a 5-year project working in coastal communities to understand how they're thinking about climate change, how they're understanding it, how they're getting their information, and then utilizing all of those things to make decisions as to how they want to live along the coast. And so I think, for thinking of kind of like the key guiding principles, one of them is reciprocity. And I think another one in this case was humility, in knowing that I don't live in a coastal community. I've never lived in a coastal community. And so there's a certain level of humility there in seeking the expertise of those who do live in those coastal communities, so that I can better understand and be able to conduct the research that is my level of expertise. And so what I've done for that project is I've built in essentially components that will utilize the expertise and elicit the expertise from the community. And so it's listening first and doing second. That's kind of the general idea. So the research projects all begin with embedment in the community, talking with community members individually in focus groups through organizations. So there's a huge qualitative component to the work before I actually do anything. And so I have stakeholder advisory groups where we're pulling in experts from the community. So I have an advisory board, right, and they're primarily academics, but parallel and as powerful is my stakeholder advisory group. And I'm going to be working with both of those groups throughout the duration of the project so that I hear both sides. So I hear the academic side, and then I also hear the community side, again, like not hierarchical, but parallel, in parallel. And so I think that approach is kind of the key. And so, right, it's a potential future project, but I just wanted to say, like, that's how I've set it up for it to be more co-produced.
A couple of years ago, we had an idea of a challenge that North Carolina was going to face. We had this idea, this is the Institute for Emerging Issues, had this theory that at some point it was going to be really important for everybody in North Carolina to have access to broadband. And so we started working on that, and we also had a solution, which we were really excited about, which was that everybody needed access to broadband. We needed to string wires and shoot up satellites and use cell phone towers and to do that. And that was great, and that's what everybody thought was the solution until we started talking to people in communities. And what they said is, look, there's a boatload of money coming down, and we're going to solve this access problem in probably 2 to 3 years. And now it looks like maybe in the next year there's enough federal money coming down to solve that problem. What the people in community said was, the problem is, if we build it, will they come? And the numbers at that time were that once you had broadband access, only 50% of it actually paid, 50% of families paid to bring it into their homes. And so that became the research problem. We'd come in with this very clear hypothesis, and as soon as we started talking to people, everybody said, yeah, that's great, we don't care. This is the problem nobody's working on. And so it became just a dramatically more useful program that we were able to run because we didn't insist on going with the first hypothesis, and instead we're able to focus it in on a problem that people actually had, and that's resulted in our raising so far $3 million, which is a lot for this particular institute to work on that particular problem. But it never would have come if we had just delivered the stone commandments to a community and said, okay, we're going to fix your problem that turns out most people didn't care as much about.
I was going to kind of pull out a theme that I've been hearing, which is the importance of mediators. It could either be leaders on the community side, or it could be professionals, such as our great bookends here, who are skilled, who have community base and are skilled at this kind of intermediary work. I don't think that the task of co-production can be just delegated, like, you hire a science communication specialist and they do all of that part, because it does require the presence of the scientists in the community in order for any kind of reciprocity to happen. But it's not something that you have to do on your own. There's a lot of professionals and community leaders that can act as intermediaries to make that kind of work.
If I could build on that just real quickly. One of the challenges and opportunities that we have in academia and in community-based work is incentivizing academics to think that they can do co-production, that they're able or talented or trained. We're not trained to do that work, right? We're trained to do dissections or PCR or whatever it is. So one of the pieces that the Kenan Institute for Engineering, Technology, and Science, KEATS, here at NC State, and Sea Grant and the Water Institute and Space Grant have done is partner together to build a funding opportunity, right? Incentivize faculty to link with community leaders or individuals. It could be industry, it could be a farmer, it could be, in our space, aquaculture, oysterman, it could be a town planner, to co-create a proposal and build some opportunity. They aren't all successful because sometimes it's just a letter from the community, and that's not really what that is, but it develops some skills over time so that the next time that proposal comes in, based on the feedback from reviewers, there's an evolution of skills in that space. Because I think that often the desire to be a community and co-produced is there. But how we don't have a training process for workforce development in that space. And I think that that's a real gap.
I would agree with that.
I'd like
And-
to build off of that
Yep.
as well, if
And then we'll go
possible.
to a
Okay,
question.
because I think there's two things I'd like to pick up on. I completely agree, right? This is hard. This is it's hard and rewarding at the same time. We could just do it the easier way, which I think would be research on communities, and we'd still get published. But I think it'd be a little heartless and soulless and not living up to, right, like the land grant challenge.
Or the white paper.
Yeah, or the white paper, right? But I do want to say too, so far as like incentivizing, I have seen a really rapid shift, in even the last few years, in the use of co-production and engagement in the truest sense of engagement, like the mutual engagement within NSF. Calls for proposals. And I just was in a PI meeting last week for the advancement of informal science learning, that program, and it was all about engagement and co-production. And one of the things that they said is that it's not going to cut it anymore to bring in a science comm person to drop the knowledge. It's not going to be enough anymore to just say that you have a letter of commitment from some community member, that it has to be equal. It's like a true equitable position of the researcher and the community.
And resource.
And the resources. Yeah, they were not playing with that either. So it's, I think that it is shifting more towards incentivizing true engagement, which I think is great because it's super important to have that, incentivizing push there. But I still agree with you that even with that, the training for how to do it is lacking, right? And so I've learned the hard way what to do and what not to do.
Mary, I know you want to go to questions,
I
but
know.
I just don't want to leave this segment without at least naming that at some point today, we should talk a little bit about some of the work that Jean is doing on a group called STIR, that is building some of those skills for faculty. One of the questions always is, where does this experience come from? And part of it comes from people who've been doing it. And so being able to take advantage of this is one of the goals of the Strengthening the Impact of Research, or STIR program, that Jean and others have been working on.
Well, and actually that will tie in nicely, because the question actually, you did that really well, Leslie. It ties the two together. So Branda was commenting that, you mentioned the dual community academic process, and she was asking if, there has been innovative solutions on creating that space and aligning the incentives for that community engaged work. So it really kind of ties, and maybe STIR is one of those efforts to create that space along with that. And I think each of you were starting to touch on the incentive part of that, but how about creating the space?
So capacity building and incentives. At NC State, we have a great model, which is extension. That's been around for 100 years, and they do community engagement right. And it also shows the kind of infrastructure that you need. I think that the university as a whole, and the Coastal Initiative in specific, should make it a top priority to build capacity among faculty to do this and build a culture where this kind of activity is actually rewarded within the current promotion and tenure system. So the STIR program that Leslie mentioned is a pilot university initiative that doesn't yet have a permanent funding. If you ever happen to want to lobby your local provost to continue it. But our goal is to take a cohort of people that are really, really interested in public engagement work and would love to do it, and to help them make the transition into doing it. And not just doing it as a side project, but as a core part of their identity as a researcher. So we help them, it's less in fact about skills building, it's more about imagining how your research and community needs could fit together, and then making a plan for early steps to build out, to start this long process that we've been talking about. This is one intervention, but it clearly needs to be followed up with continued mentoring, continued development amongst the cohort, spreading the word throughout the university so it doesn't just become the exceptional few that have these kinds of skills, and then a culture change for the university to live up to its clearly stated mission to make a difference here in North Carolina. And I really do see the Coastal Resilience Initiative as leading the way in trying to develop a model for how the best quality, most cutting edge science can be at the same time highly relevant to immediate community needs. Go for it.
Susan, could you talk a little bit, Jean mentioned extension, and one of the things I think extension does really, really well is the needs assessment process. So rather than, thinking we know what communities need, actually looking at that.
Yeah, and that's it's great. It's a great tool, right? It is a tool. Needs assessment often, when we think about extension, is one of the first formulaic pieces that we would do in order to scope what a project might look like. That can come in many forms, right? We think surveys, we think community engagement, focus groups, we think listening. Like the needs assessment doesn't have to be a point and click piece. It's a grouping of tools to help, again, listen to what it is that a community needs. And we think, I'll back off the needs assessment just a little bit, because with conversation comes an understanding, and that's sort of a needs assessment too. And one of the pieces recently, again, post-hurricane in aquaculture, was our aquaculture specialist at the time was trying to understand how to get federal funds to an aquaculturist in order to replace or either seed set for oysters, gear, how they were excluded from, we'll talk about policy, that's a good question for you all, how they're excluded from small business, insurance in certain ways from an agriculture perspective. And that was a needs assessment. That listening was an understanding of, do they need support in writing a grant? Do they need support in accessing broadband, accessing the information on the internet to find out what they need to do? Who should they talk to for lobbying functionally to be included in insurance recovery pieces in the future? So the needs assessment is early and often, and it's continually, right? It's an adaptive piece that needs to be touched on regularly.
To highlight a couple comments. First of all, there's been appreciation for listening first and doing second with that. And Susan, you were mentioning a little bit more about extension. So Frank Lopez, who I think works with you. Yes, if you look in, anyone's interested in the chat box, he put the link to the Collaborative Research Grant Program, so folks can find that funding there. And then a question follow-up is, so everyone has mentioned the benefits of working with the extension. How would a faculty member go about engaging the extension to work with them on a project, or use them as that community contact source?
I can open that question. If it's community or cooperative extension has place-based, right, community county level agents, and I would argue that is a first stop in your community or county of interest, because they would have those long-standing relationships. In terms of coastal resilience, that would be through our extension team. And we do watershed pieces as well, because their networks that they bring are enormous. And that's what extension really is known for, is knowing who to consider including in those conversations early on. And so I would encourage folks that are interested in the coastal resilience space, or anything that touches coastal resilience, which is enormous, right? We've created a very large overarching area of opportunity to reach out. Frank's a good point person for extension within Sea Grant, but also those county extension specialists within cooperative, depending on the topic, would be an awesome connection as well. And they're listed. Their resources are online.
Tell you one idea we're working on that I think is a potential model that others could use, and it's something that hasn't been announced yet. I guess it has now. But it's in the spring. We're doing something called Ask NC State, and it's just an attempt to get faculty who aren't extension in conversation with people in communities. This is going to be in Nash, Edgecombe, Wilson counties. And the relationship with extension is that those are folks who know how to find out what a community is concerned about. So we've asked the local extension agents to turn up some questions that extension can't answer, and then we're going to match faculty members who have ideas about that with folks in conversation. And so it's a dialogue that leverages off of the strengths of cooperative extension, but recognizes that there are other assets that NC State brings to the table that aren't necessarily extension specific. And along the way, I think the participating faculty who are non-extension are going to maybe come to a deeper appreciation of what extension can do. So, if you were working in a coastal community and trying to figure out how to make the right connections in that community, who would you talk to? Well, you talk to Sea Grant, obviously, but you'd also talk to your extension office. And the number of connections, the depth of connections, the length of connections, the breadth of connections that extension has in any given county is greater than anything that any other individual faculty member is going to have.
I would like to piggyback on that because, because we talk about incentivizing faculty to engage in this sort of research, but also it's the support it's not just like Nike. I don't think we can just be like, oh yeah, just do it. It takes a lot of work to be able to do this successfully, and so there needs to be, I think, even more supports embedded within, NC State infrastructure to help people accomplish this successfully. And so, STIR is an example, but, I also want to say, I study social learning, so I study how people, learn from their networks. Extension is another. I think we need to build up a deep and wide resource base to help faculty who are interested in doing this to actually be able to do it.
That's a really great point, and I wanted to just seg off that for a minute before. Please continue to put your questions in. I'm going to go back to you online in a second, but that capacity building, in my sort of leadership roles, in the olden days, and I guess I have enough gray hair to be able to say that, when you started as an academic, when I started as an academic, it was just assumed that you knew how to teach. Even that all you'd ever done before was TA a lab, come on, people. And we now know that there's a lot of skill involved in teaching well, and we provide support for faculty in learning how to teach. It occurs to me that we need to do the same thing around engagement, that people can't just come in if they've not engaged before. I used to have an argument with a good friend and colleague of mine who did theoretical ecology, who said, you talk to the public way too much. What are you doing? And it's like, well, I enjoyed that. I'm enough of a ham, but I stepped into it quite a number of times because I didn't have a Gene Goodwin or a Casey Busch to tell me how to do engagement well. So how can we develop? I'm delighted to hear, some of these things coming along, but how can we build that capacity in our faculty, make them comfortable that they can do it, teach them some rudimentary skills and how to listen and turn that into useful information for them. There's a clue that
The crossword puzzle I was doing this morning that, it was something like reaction of student when they know the answer. So it was ooh was the answer. So I'll just say one part of the answer, one small part, is a new database that we're creating called the Collaboratory. And the idea is to both allow community to look into NC State and see what areas we're working in, but more importantly, probably for NC State to be able to look at the different assets that it has, so that if somebody wants to work on coastal resilience, they would be able to look in and see, oh my gosh, look at the 240 faculty that are doing something on this. Here's the thing I'm interested in. So to be able to do an electronic search and determine who's doing what with whom and how, I think makes it easier for somebody to decide to do this work. If they don't feel like, oh, well, I'm the only person who's really thinking about this. And so we're hoping over the next year to really build out this database so that people, when they're just on the fuzzy front end of thinking of an idea, you know, they can do what they've always done, which is ask their friends and colleagues and say, who's working on this? But this is another tool that might be helpful in identifying colleagues so that you don't feel like you're totally alone, or you can maybe skip a couple of the steps.
Yeah, and let me add two more. I'll put in a shameless plug for the Public Science listserv, which you can sign up, just search for Public Science at NC State, and you can sign up for the listserv on our webpage. And that's a extremely loose collection of everybody on campus that's interested in this kind of work, so it's a great place to send out announcements or ask questions. That's a very loose network. I think that Leslie has been doing great and very patient leadership over the last few years in slowly building out the kind of infrastructure that's needed. But really the next step should be that the university acknowledge the importance of this kind of work in the same way that it has an office for research to help people develop the PDU, or the research office to help people develop their proposals. There needs to be a similar office that's responsible for helping people develop their, if it's NSF universe, broader impacts work or engaged work more generally. It would leverage the success of extension. It would pull together many of the initiatives that are ongoing, but it could be a kind of central place really to bring our engagement practice to the next level and live up to the mission statement that we've set ourselves.
Part of capacity building.
Right.
Absolutely, yeah. So we do have a couple people here in the room. Do any of you have a question? Or Amanda, is there anyone else online?
There is one, and you can go first, and then, then I'll come back.
Yeah, so Dr. Busch, I think earlier in the discussion you mentioned that public engagement is a gradient. You can work on a community, with a community, or for a community. What are some of the defining features of each of those steps, and how do you make the jump from one level to the next as a researcher who wants to increase your public engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I saw you furiously writing something down, and I didn't know if I was in trouble or what happened there. So yeah, I think research on a community, right, means that you're conducting research, embedded within some sort of community. Like, and I'm using the community term. It can mean like a place or a group of people or whatever. But as a researcher, right, what happens then is you have the questions, you come in, you do your research, and you leave. And I think that's, the more traditional way of conducting research. So your findings may be accidentally helpful, but they are not necessarily meant to improve the community. So when I pictured like the two columns of like community members and researcher, there's kind of 5 categories I use, and I think these are the gradients. So it's like setting the goals. Either the goals are academic only, or they're the goals of the community, or they can be somewhere in the middle. And I think that's where this gradient fits. So if it's only academic, then it's research on a community. If it's only for the community, then it's the community's goals. And if it's research with a community, then it's somewhere in the middle. The second piece is like the methods that you use, right? So are they methods that are purely academic? They have to be rigorous, or are they methods that are community sensitive? You talked about different forms of data collection, right? Like, so what are those forms of research methods that you're using? The next one is dissemination. Like, are you looking at disseminating only in academic journals, you know? Or are you thinking about how you can disseminate the information in a way that engages stakeholders and is for the community? Or is there some place in the middle? I think what I usually wind up doing on that is writing the pure academic article, right? Because I'm untenured, so that is like the looming cloud in the room. So I have to meet, you know, that boss's requirement, but then that falls short, and so what can I provide to the community that would help the community? So I usually wind up producing 2 different products, which is fine, but, you know, and then there's, you know, kind of like those ethical concerns, you know, and how you're approaching community members' issues of equity and inclusion, right? So academically, that definition might be much different than if you're working just for the community in terms of resource allocation, voices at the table, those sorts of things. So that's kind of how I've divided it out in my head. I hope that's helpful.
Makes sense, thank you.
Sure.
You can also take Casey's class and
So,
explore.
yeah, you know, I do teach classes in informal learning over in the College of Ed, and both of those courses are completely organized around community engagement. So we use these defining principles in all parts of the course, and then you engage with a community partner to work with them to build out a product that is, and we use the right engagement with the community partner kind of model where it meets both ends of like the academic considerations and the community considerations. And so I use that as like a organizing principle around the whole course. So shameless plug for my classes. Yeah.
Well, and I'll make one more shameless plug. Chris Osborne was mentioning from the outreach versus in-reach perspective, there is a student-focused event being held in March of 2022, and that's an Eventbrite. It has the tickets, and if you're online, you can check the chat box. But it's basically on creating solutions for global blue economy. So that will be addressing that as well. And we started. Oh, go ahead, Gina, and then I have a question.
I think that there's a lot of common sense, but actually some evidence behind the fact that young scholars are significantly more interested in engaged work. And if the university doesn't serve the needs of those scholars, we're not going to get the best people here. We're not going to be able to get and retain those people. So I think that the generation that's coming up is going to be driving this work. It'd be great if we could create now a welcoming university for them. You know.
Questions we had, so we were starting to talk about capacity building for faculty here at the university. So someone asked, what is the potential for building a pipeline of non-faculty community engagement professionals? And Jean, you mentioned NSF grants. They reference NIEHS, so the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, requiring community engagement professionals. And now, right, there's only a few people on campus that have either the skills and the time to do that. So is there a potential for, you know, setting up or making available that network of community professionals that could help?
As a faculty member, I'm going to exercise my right to have opinions, even and tell the administration what it should be doing. Because of the need for engagement, there is an increasing number of basically staff positions all across campus. And most of these people are totally by themselves, and they have no opportunities for professional development. University Communications Office, UCOM, they have great professional development. CALS has a big comms unit. There you are back there. You guys are great, but I'm talking about like Center will have its science communication or engagement person. It is desperately needed to recognize these people, to bring them together and to give them serious professional development opportunities, and also then to recognize and celebrate their work. That has to be done at the highest level, because literally, I talk to these people a lot, and I've been trying to create a network, get them to network with each other, create a professional association here on campus. But there's a real need, and it needs to at least partially come from the top down. A lot of the scientists who really are interested, young scientists who are interested in engagement, often like lapse out of science and want to pursue careers in this And right now, we're not really making that very easy.
So we are winding down in terms of our time, and just in terms of pulling this together and asking our panel to weigh in one more time. I heard about the incredible importance of building trusted relationships and listening before acting. I won't go back to Casey's brilliant on, with, and for engagement, but reciprocity and humility being key characteristics that we need to recognize the incredible role that intermediators can play in bringing communities and researchers together, that we have to create capacity among our faculty, many of whom really want to do this work but are not quite prepared to do that work, and that's something the institution could very productively help with, among other things. But I wanted to give each of our panelists a final opportunity to tell us a little bit. You know, this initiative, as Leslie, you mentioned, is just getting going. We've been out there for a year plus, and you know, we've made this bold statement that we want engagement to be a key part of what we do. So if we are to be successful in our quest, what are some of the key steps we need to do right now as an initiative and in the university? We talked a little bit about within the university. And if we can take some of those steps, what might our program look like in 5 years? You can take either part of that or both.
Yeah, and I apologize, I have to head out for 1 o'clock. But I think this initiative and the 247 or whatever the current number is of people who care about it, the challenge with any new initiative is finding the bandwidth to care, because it's the last thing that's added into someone's responsibilities. And so finding a way to integrate this with the research interests of as many people as possible, showing them the relevance of it, and then being able to demonstrate to those who have the ability, the power of the purse string, the collective power of this to result in meaningful research, meaningful distinction for NC State, I think is going to be the biggest challenge. Is you know, there's a lot of other stuff going on. Everybody, you know, some people are trying to build a portfolio for tenure. Is this going to help with that? Is this going to be responsive to some part of the strategic plan, being able to very clearly show this ties in with NC State Strategic Plan 3.4.2 is going to be important. And then it's just a matter of regularly talking about what's happening and giving people a sense of momentum that this is going somewhere. This is not a fly-by-night proposal. This is not a temporary initiative. It's something that has some momentum, and small victories are building on other small victories and leading to something bigger.
Awesome. Thank you, Leslie. And you can escape. I know you need to. Thank you so much for coming. Casey?
I don't know if I'm going to answer your question directly, but I know that we have like focused on research, and that was kind of maybe the focus of the panel. But I also think that this, to Jean's point, I think that our students, the younger generations, upcoming researchers, but then also the whole host of students that we have on campus that have no plans to become researchers. I think that this kind of approach is something that could be attractive across research and teaching and service. So across, kind of like an underlying foundational approach to our research, our teaching, and our service as faculty, but then, for our students too. I just think it could be more successful if we look at it in a little bit more well-rounded way.
Yeah, I'll actually follow up with that with, my 5-year vision would be that the Coastal Initiative, the Coastal Resilience Initiative has 2 or 3 projects, and there's undergraduates going out there. They're community-based. They're producing great science. Undergraduates are going out there for internships and for short-term research positions. when we recruit new faculty, we take them all out there and show them because that's what NC State does best. But I don't think we're going to get to that 5-year vision unless the Coastal Resilience Initiative is many things, one of which is like big science, right? Interdisciplinary, get big grants and become a center. Unless the community engagement part is actually put first on the agenda, that is insisted that we must start there. I think that's the way to get to where we want to go and not to leave it as an add-on at the end.
Yeah, I think those are all great. I think we should do that. I also think we need to make sure that we have an understanding of a culturally competent group, because we can't send ourselves and each other and our students out to these communities without understanding the setting and the context of the community. So I think in 5 years, we'll have had a series of understandings, field trips, spaces that are engaged already, to frame those large research proposals, which is a big driver, we know, around what is appropriate in those communities. So I think those are the challenges and opportunities coming up.
Thank you, Susan, and that's kind of a great segue just to wind up. We are almost out of time. Thank you so much for tuning in. Just a couple of quick things. First, our expertise link on our website is going live very soon. So please watch for a message, and those of you who are on our collective list right now are going to be invited through an email to review and update your listing, which we've started for you under the expertise link. And you can add things to it like a short bio, a picture, a link to your personal web page. And we have pulled recent publications and grant titles from the master databases. So we want you to self-identify your expertise and interest. And this, we hope, is a great tool for collaboration as we build those big collaborative projects, which include engagement. So engagement, interest is going to be something there. Susan mentioned equity considerations. We are posting more and more grant opportunities on our site. There's a great one. It may be coming up too quickly, but cumulative health impacts at the intersection of climate change, environmental justice, vulnerable populations and life stages, community-based research for solutions, request for proposals. So our funders are looking at these issues, and it's our opportunity to shine and be a star in responding to those kinds of things. And then finally, in 2 weeks, we will have another interdisciplinary panel, a bit different from this one. We are going to discuss the general topic of coupled human and natural systems from very different perspectives. And we've got, again, another all-star lineup. Gavin Smith, professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning in the College of Design. Dave Eggleston, distinguished professor, can't get that out, Marine Earth and Atmospheric Sciences in the College of Sciences and director of CMAST, and Casey Dietrich in the Department of Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering in the College of Engineering. So please make plans to come back, and we'll do the same thing with again, a different round of how do we connect and how do we do more in this great focal area of coastal resilience and sustainability. So thank you all very, very much. Really appreciate you participating. And once again, thank you to Casey, to Jean, and to Susan for sharing your wonderful expertise and perspective with us today. Really, really enlightening. Appreciate it.
Thank you for putting engagement first.
You bet. All right, thank you.